Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode in my Midweek mystery series, where today I've got another historical mystery for you. This is going to be about the disappearance of Theodosia Burr Alston, the daughter of US Vice President Aaron Burr. If you're American, I'm sure you'll definitely know who Aaron Burr is just because. If you're not and you know who Aaron Burr is, then you're either a history nerd or a musical theatre nerd, because yes, this is the same Theodosia that Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote Dear Theodosia about in Hamilton. Can you tell that I am said musical theatre nerd? In late December 1812, Theodosia Burr Alston boarded a ship headed to New York to reunite with her father, but she never made it and nobody knows what happened on that fateful journey. Today we're going to explore what might have happened. But first, I want to give a big thank you to Magellan TV for sponsoring this week's video. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service, and I'm sure you've all already heard of why I love Magellan TV so much, so instead of listing all of the reasons today, I'm just going to jump straight in and tell you about a documentary that I've watched recently and absolutely loved. Love Wins Over Hate. This documentary is seriously so interesting. It explores the lives of 6 former white supremacists and ultra-conservatives. Each of them tells their story, the process of being filled with hate, anger and rage, to their new lives of acceptance and appreciation of diversity. And not only that, they've also all gone on to educate others to try and get more people to live the happiness and peace that they now do. This documentary is very painful to watch at points, it's full of raw emotions and it is difficult to get through, but I think it's really important to understand how the minds of these people, white supremacists and ultra-conservatives, work. This is the kind of mindset that you can't argue with. You can't make people like this change their minds, because there will always be another reason, another person, another group to hate. They've got to come to the conclusion themselves. Honestly, this might be one of my favourite documentaries I've ever watched, so if you want to try out Magellan TV for yourself and watch Love Wins Over Hate, then you can click on the link in the description box to claim your 1-month free trial. You can watch all of the documentaries you can dream of, and I know a lot of you are true crime fans, so I'm pleased to announce they have more true crime and history documentaries than you could dream of. There's so many on there. But back to this video, let's start this one with a bit of history, shall we? Aaron Burr Jr. was an American politician and lawyer who served as a 3rd ever Vice President of the United States from 1801 to 1805. He rubbed shoulders with the founding fathers of the USA throughout his entire life, but he would never be officially credited as one, even though he did have a big impact on early politics in the USA. This is probably because he would famously go on to kill Alexander Hamilton, who was considered a founding father, in a duel after a long rivalry. Burr would go down as a villain in American history, but as with every human, there were many sides to him. In 1778, Aaron Burr met Theodosia Bartow Prevost, who was married to a British officer, Jacques Prevost. But Jacques was away a lot, and Burr took whatever opportunity he could to go and visit Theodosia at her home in New Jersey. He was immediately enamoured with her. She was 10 years older than him, she was married to a British officer, and this was a time in which gossip could make or break you. Nothing about their relationship should have worked. But it did. Burr was head over heels in love with Theodosia, and when he learned that Jacques had died of yellow fever in 1781, he jumped at the chance and married Theodosia the next year, moving with her to Wall Street in Manhattan. The year after that, their only surviving child, a daughter, Theodosia Burr, was born. And from the day of her birth, young Theodosia became the apple of her father's eye, and his entire life became about her, his daughter. Especially when the other love of his life, his wife, ended up dying from cancer in 1794. Young Theodosia became his everything, and Aaron Burr vowed to provide the best life possible for her, and he did exactly that. Aaron Burr was decades ahead of his time, centuries even, what you could consider a male feminist of the 18th century. He was determined that Theodosia was going to have everything in life. Anything that a man could do, she could do as well. He famously wrote, "I hope yet by her to convince the world what neither sex appears to believe, that women have souls." Theodosia was said to be a charming child. She had her father's brains and her mother's beauty, and Burr made sure that she was incredibly well educated, her education closely supervised by him at all times. She learned the standards for women of the time, French, music, dancing, but her father also pushed her to study arithmetic, Latin, Greek, and English composition. She'd practiced her writing by sending endless letters to her father, who would reply in kind, complete with criticisms of her writing. And his efforts paid off because Theodosia became somewhat of a child prodigy, fluent in Latin, French, German, Greek, and English by the age of 12, just 2 years after the death of her mother. Theodosia Burr was considered one of America's first great women of learning and achievement. She was widely acknowledged for her intelligence and sophistication. She became her father's closest confidant after her mother's death, and by the age of just 14, she was a hostess at her father's country estate, Richmond Hill, a huge honour. She would support her father's political career by hosting these huge grand parties at the estate, hosting people like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. A huge part of Burr's political growth was assisted by his daughter's charm. She was a very popular socialite. But then, in the big presidential election of 1800, Burr and Thomas Jefferson received the same number of electoral votes. And that's a whole long story this video isn't about, but essentially Congress voted Jefferson for president and Burr became vice president. It was a massive blow to him, and it probably didn't help that the very next year, in 1801, his beloved Theodosia got married and left home. Theodosia had no shortage of admirers in her lifetime, but she ended up marrying Joseph Alston, a wealthy landowner from South Carolina, and it's widely considered that this was not a marriage of love, but of convenience and economics. Burr was in a pretty shaky financial position, and he wasn't sure how he was going to be able to hold on to his estate, so Theodosia's marriage to a very prominent southern family would have given him some security. And I'm sure had her father asked Theodosia to do such a thing for him, she would have obliged. But even though Theodosia married Joseph for her father, it still would have been hard for him. The marriage also helped further push Theodosia into the socialite spotlight. I suppose you could say that Theodosia Burr and Joseph Alston were kind of the 1800s version of the Kardashians. They became the first recorded couple to honeymoon at Niagara Falls, starting a trend that has lasted a couple hundred years. It's still a very popular honeymoon spot. If the Alstons were doing something, other people did it too. They settled down in their new home, the Alston family plantation, the Oaks, in Georgetown County, South Carolina. But Theodosia very quickly realised that she hated the South. She was a New York girl. She couldn't stand the sticky heat, she struggled in the southern social scene, and like her father, she wasn't a fan of slavery. The Alston family owned upwards of 200 enslaved people, and Theodosia didn't much like it. I mean, the Burrs had owned enslaved people themselves, as was the norm of the time, but if history is to be believed, he did go to an effort to ensure that they were educated and treated better. I probably wouldn't go as far as to say treated well, but definitely better than others. When the New York State Legislature considered a bill for gradual abolition in 1785, Burr counter-proposed with an amendment that called for immediate emancipation of all people living in slavery. History is very complicated and messy. But on top of all of that, all of the cultural differences that Theodosia experienced, she mostly just missed her father, especially when her husband got elected to the State House of Representatives and would frequently travel away for long periods. Although the marriage was at first an economical proposal, the couple did eventually grow fond of one another, and Theodosia missed her husband when he was away. In 1802, Theodosia gave birth to her one and only child, Aaron Burr Alston. After her son's birth, she would suffer from long bouts of ill health, and I couldn't find any solid information on what exactly her illness was. One article on Medium said that the labour was long and she was left with a painful prolapsed uterus, but that was on Medium. She would travel back up to New York often with her son in tow, taking long spa breaks to rest and recover. And with her husband away for long stints, young Aaron became the focus of her whole world, and the whole focus of his grandfather's, his namesake's world as well. Aaron Burr had big plans for Aaron Alston's future, that's for sure. But then everything started to fall apart. In 1804, it became clear that Jefferson was about to drop Burr from his ticket in the 1804 election, so Burr was about to lose his job as vice president. Burr was furious, but even more so when he discovered that Alexander Hamilton had opposed him and had been spreading rumours that he was a dangerous man and one who ought not be trusted with the reins of government. After a lot of letters sent between them didn't seem to resolve the issue, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel which took place in Weehawken, New Jersey on 11th of July 1804. We all know how that ended. Burr shot Hamilton and Hamilton died. Burr was charged with murder, but nothing really came of this. He eventually escaped prosecution through a bit of a loophole, because although the gunshot had been fired in New Jersey, Hamilton hadn't actually died until he was back in New York, so two different jurisdictions. Regardless, Burr fled to South Carolina to kind of let things bubble over, which is where Theodosia lived, but eventually he ended up returning to Washington to complete his term as vice president, which ended in 1805. After that, high society pretty much kicked him out and he just travelled the country looking for work. That didn't work, so he did what any sane man would try to do. He attempted to establish a new country made of western states which he would rule as emperor. Yeah. In the spring of 1807, he was arrested for treason and was tried, Theodosia standing by her father's side every step of the way. Ultimately, he was acquitted, but America wasn't exactly going to be the best place for him anymore, so Theodosia helped him flee to Europe. She was devastated that she was losing her father to another continent. It was a self-imposed exile, but it had to be done. Then 5 years pass and tragedy strikes again for Theodosia when her young son, Aaron Alston, dies of malaria in June 1812. Theodosia's entire life came falling down around her, but luckily for her, her dear father was due back in New York the very next month. But when it came to it, Theodosia wasn't in a fit state to travel to New York to visit him. Her grief had taken over, she was still ill, she just couldn't do it. So her planned journey had to wait until December 1812. Because remember, this was 1812, it wasn't as easy as just jumping on a plane to make the journey from South Carolina to New York, or even as easy as driving the journey. No, Theodosia had to go by sea, via ship. And this is where the mystery portion of the video begins. Having recently been made governor of South Carolina, Joseph Alston, Theodosia's husband, was unable to join her on her trip to New York, but he accompanies her to Georgetown and puts her on a ship called the Patriot, along with her maid, an old family friend of the Burrs called Dr. Timothy Green, and a small crew. The ship was actually what is called a schooner. I don't know much about ships, so that doesn't mean much to me, but maybe it does to you. The dictionary definition reads, a sailing ship with 2 or more masts, typically with a foremast smaller than the main mast, and having gaff-rigged lower masts. I don't know, it was a ship. Importantly actually, it was a private ship. Theodosia had packed a number of her favourite dresses for the journey and a portrait of herself that she intended to give as a gift to her father. She hadn't seen him for 5 years at this point, who knew when she would next see him? A portrait was a great present. This was all happening at a very precarious time in US politics. The War of 1812 between the US and Great Britain was raging, and the waters all up the East Coast would have been filled with British boats. Now, Joseph Alston was a powerful man with connections, which he used to get a letter to the British Navy who were blockading the coast, requesting safe passage for his wife. So Theodosia boards the ship and it sets sail in late afternoon on 31st of December 1812 for what should have been a 5 or 6 day trip up to New York. Only of course those 5 or 6 days passed and Theodosia and the ship as a whole never arrived in New York. Burr waited for 2 weeks but still no ship or even word came of where they were. Aaron Burr and Joseph Alston started to become frantic with worry. Joseph wrote, "Another mail and still no letter. I hear 2 rumours of a gale off Cape Hatteras at the beginning of the month. The state of my mind is dreadful." Which brings us to some theories as to what may have happened to poor Theodosia, and believe me, there's no shortage of them. It didn't take Burr and Alston a lot of investigative work to realise that the ship was lost. There had been no signs of it at all. but immediately both of their general consensus was that the ship had gone down in the terrible weather at the time. As Alston wrote in the letter I mentioned a second ago, he specifically believed that the ship had been wrecked off of Cape Hatteras, which is in North Carolina. I put Georgetown and Cape Hatteras into Google Maps to see how far they are from each other, but shockingly there's no option for directions via 1812 ship travel. It's an over 7-hour, almost 400-mile drive today via land though. It was later learned that the ship had indeed been stopped by a British fleet off of Hatteras on January 2nd, and Alston's letter to the Navy had indeed worked. They had been allowed to pass with no drama. But beyond that, nothing more was known. That was the last time they were seen on their journey, and it was later that night that the storm and gale hit Cape Hatteras, forcing the British fleet to scatter. The question was, had the Patriot managed to get far enough away in the number of hours after being stopped that it was unaffected by the storm? You're probably all thinking that this is the most obvious explanation, right? Like, no mystery here, they went down in the storm. I would agree if it weren't for one simple point, that there has never again been any sign of the ship. Burr and Alston were sure that the ship had gone down in the storm, and they waited with bated breath for parts of it to turn up on local shores. But it never did. Not even the smallest piece of the boat ever washed up on the beaches. In the following years, Aaron Burr would send searchers to look for shipwrecks in Nassau and Bermuda, but they would have no success. He never sent any searchers to the Outer Banks though, which is where they likely went down, which is strange as that's surely where Theodosia met her fate. Whatever that fate may have been. However, in the 2 centuries since, there have been lots of searches for shipwrecks in this area, and no sign of the Patriot has ever been found. I do wonder if Burr had some insider information that forced him to search Nassau and Bermuda instead, but whatever that information may have been is lost to history now. Could it be possible that the ship went down in the storm and it just so happened that nothing from it ever washed up? For sure, but it was unlikely. When a friend tried to console Burr by saying that Theodosia could still be alive, he replied, No, she is indeed dead. Were she still alive, all the prisons in the world could not keep her from her father. Which brings us onto our next theory, pirates. Next to the bad weather theory, this was considered to be the most likely at the time. Burr chose to believe that Theodosia had died in a storm because the thought of her being captured by pirates was just too much. The Outer Banks, specifically the area around Cape Hatteras, was known to be notorious for pirates in this time. The pirates were known as the Carolina Bankers or Carolina Wreckers and would basically do what you would think pirates would do. They would board ships, murder both passengers and crews before plundering the ships. They would often lure ships to the shoals, wrecking them by tying a lantern around the neck of a horse and walking it up and down the beach. Sailors wouldn't be able to distinguish this light from that of a safely anchored ship, and so they would steer themselves towards the light thinking they were going to be able to dock, but they'd find themselves stuck before they knew it. And then the pirates would take their chance. Over the years there have been many whispers of pirates surrounding this mystery, but never anything concrete. In 1910, a man called Mr. J.A. Elliott from Norfolk, Virginia, made a statement saying that in early 1813, the dead body of a refined young woman had been washed ashore in Cape Charles and had been buried on the farm of the man who found her. This burial site has never been discovered though, and of course Mr. J.A. Elliott wouldn't have been alive in 1813, so this was likely a word-of-mouth story. A journalist called Foster Haley claimed that he had discovered documents that had said the Patriot had been captured by a pirate vessel captained by John Howard Payne, and that every single person on the boat had been murdered, including a woman who was obviously a noblewoman or a lady of high birth. However, the documents that he supposedly found were never cited. In 1820, 2 men were being executed for other crimes, but before that happened they confessed to plundering and sinking the Patriot, saying they killed everyone aboard, but nothing could ever be proven. Then there's a legend to do with the Karankawa tribe, Native American people living on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Rumour has it that the earliest American settlers in the Gulf Coast reported a Karankawa warrior wearing a gold locket inscribed with the name Theodosia. Now, Theodosia has never been a hugely popular name. The highest it's ever ranked was actually also on the earliest name list I could find, ranking number 576 in 1880, so it never even broke the top 100. All of which to say, the name is unusual today, but it was never necessarily a common name. A locket bearing the name Theodosia would have been a rarity. That's if this report was even true in the first place. The warrior claimed that he had found a shipwrecked at the mouth of the San Bernard River after a bad storm, and after hearing a cry, he found a white woman chained to the bulkhead by her ankle. She was naked bar the locket. The woman fainted and the warrior set her free, carrying her to the shore. When she came around, she told him that she was the daughter of a white man, the great chief of the white men, who had been misunderstood and forced to leave the country. She gave him the locket, saying that if he ever met a white man, he was to show them the locket and share her story. And then she died in his arms. This sounds more like the plot of a movie than in real life, but this is how the story goes. But the question is, how did this ship end up in the Texas Gulf Coast, which is the complete opposite direction of where Theodosia's ship, the Patriot, was headed? I know a storm can throw you off course, but this, of course, I have my suspicions. There's also question over how this man knew fluent English, and I could find only one extensive article on this story, which will of course be linked down below, in which it was reported that this man had apparently learned English from a hermit who had travelled to southeastern Texas. I'm not one to say this story definitely isn't true. Improbable? Yes. Impossible? No. It more seems like a myth to me, but you never know. But then we have the most famous theory surrounding Theodosia Burr Alston, and that has to do with the portrait that she took on the trip to gift to her father. More than 50 years after her disappearance, in 1869, a doctor called Dr. William Poole was vacationing in Nags Head, North Carolina. Whilst on this holiday, he was called to provide medical care to a destitute old woman called Mrs. Mann, or Mrs. Mann-Caring, depending on which source you're reading. She couldn't afford to pay Paul for his services, so instead offered him a portrait of a beautiful young woman. Or some sources say that he was so taken by the photo in her home that he offered to buy it from her. I suppose it doesn't matter which version, the point is this woman had this portrait. When asked how she'd come to own this beautiful portrait, she told a story of how her first husband, a fisherman, had gifted it to her when they were young. She couldn't remember exactly when, but was sure it was during the war with Britain in 1812. Her husband and some friends were lounging on the beach at Nag's Head and saw a smart-looking ship heading towards the shore until she eventually got beached. The men got in a small boat and rowed to the ship, boarding it when no one responded to their calls. They found it empty, with a table complete with a half-finished meal, because there's always a half-finished meal in any abandoned ship story, a number of silk dresses scattered over the floor, and a portrait hanging on the wall. It seemed that whoever had once been aboard the ship had abandoned it in a hurry, and the husband took the portrait. But now it belonged to Dr. William Poole, and straight away he had noted the resemblance to Theodosia Burr, finding known portraits of her to compare to. That made him become more sure it was her, and everyone else he showed tended to agree it was a striking resemblance. Even some people who had known Theodosia in real life agreed. However, there is one report that Mary Alston Pringle, Theodosia's sister-in-law, went to look at the portrait but did not recognise it as Theodosia. Today you'll find this maybe portrait of Theodosia at Yale University's Lewis Walpole Library, so if you're ever nearby, maybe go and check it out. By this point in time, both Aaron Burr and Joseph Alston had died themselves in 1836 and 1814 respectively, so they couldn't be depended on to make the identification, and arguably, they would have been the people that knew. So what conclusion can we draw from the portrait story? The general thought at the time was that it may well have been Theodosia, and if that was the case, then it did seem that pirates had boarded the ship, removed the people, and subsequently killed them, and looted the ship before abandoning it and setting it sail. But why would the pirates leave behind silk dresses, which would have been very valuable in this time, and a portrait of this quality? That just doesn't match up. Just like everything else in this mystery, the puzzle pieces don't quite fit together with this theory. The last theory I want to mention is that of a mysterious grave at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Alexandria, Virginia, where there's an unmarked grave belonging to a female stranger. According to local law, in 1816, a man and woman arrived in Alexandria, the woman incredibly sick and the man refusing to answer any questions about their identity. The woman died soon after, and many people believe that the couple could have been Theodosia and Dr. Green, but more people don't believe that. First of all, the ship went missing in 1812, 1813, and this was 1816, so what had happened in that time? There is suspicion that the two of them fell in love on the journey and ran away together, but that doesn't answer any questions as to what happened to the ship, and the crew, and Theodosia's maid. This is a very loose theory. I wasn't going to mention it, but I knew I'd get people mentioning it in the comments if I didn't. I don't think there's anything in this. I think just because a man and woman turned up and refused to talk about their identity, it doesn't mean it's Theodosia Burr. There's so many more theories I could share, but they're mostly just folklore, myths shared down generations. There's never been anything concrete. The best piece of evidence we have here is the Nag's Head portrait, and even that's questionable. Some suspect that the British downed the ship, but that isn't really how warfare worked at this time. They had the correct papers, Alston had sent a message ahead, and they couldn't have just downed a ship without anyone knowing about it. So even that theory is questionable. It just wasn't worth the British position in the war to attack an innocent ship. It wouldn't have helped them and would all round have made things a lot worse. Warfare is planned to the letter, so the theory that they downed the ship doesn't really make sense. Which I suppose brings us to the end of this story. Now whenever you listen to Dear Theodosia, you'll have a bit more context on why that song pulls at so many heartstrings. A father's all-consuming love for his daughter, only for her to be lost at sea, never to be found. It's a really sad story. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.